because I hated meat. Like, I really hated it my whole life. So I've never been a strict vegetarian, but I've been very plant-based.
Emily, how did you find carnivore?
So I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes in the year 2000. So at that point, I was 6 years old. And so I grew up with type 1 diabetes. Um, and I have to say, growing up with type 1 diabetes, it was really not a big deal. And I know that sounds weird, but basically, I had my parents helping me out and giving me consistent meals, kind of a regular, consistent schedule. I had their help with my management. And so I seriously think from the age of 6 to 18, like I could confidently say that having type 1 diabetes didn't feel like a problem. I didn't experience many extreme high blood sugars. I never had to be hospitalized. So yeah, like I thought everything was fine basically. And then I, turn 18, go to university, eventually move away for grad school, start to just like manage everything on my own, and then get married, start my career. And basically, by the time I get to my mid 20s, my diabetes management is not so great anymore. So I started to have fluctuations, like fluctuations every day. So I would say on a weekly basis, but really on a daily basis. My blood sugars are fluctuating between like 3 and 20 and 3 and 20. And I did convert that to American numbers. So for any Americans listening, I think that's between like 54 and 360. So massive fluctuations, like on a weekly to daily basis, basically. So at that point, I'm getting kind of afraid. Like you're always taught as a type 1 diabetic that high blood sugars mean you're going to have complications. So every time my blood sugar is going this high, I'm like, what does this mean? Like, what am I faced with in the future? How much am I tearing myself apart from the inside out? And then there were kind of two inflating incidents that made me even more afraid, I suppose. And so the first is that when I would have really high blood sugars when I was sleeping, I would often be woken up with bad tingling in my feet. And so, something we're told as diabetics is that you can damage the nerves in your feet. It's called peripheral neuropathy. And eventually, this can lead to having to get your feet amputated. So, like, I'm like mid 20s, right? It's not a nice feeling to think this could be happening. Uh, and then the other thing that happened was I had gone to the eye doctor for just like a checkup. And what he had said, he didn't say I had complications. He said because my blood sugar had been high recently, he couldn't confirm if my prescription was temporarily changed due to high blood sugars or if it was truly changed. So this was like an indication to me that my blood sugar control was affecting my vision, which was another scary thing to have happen. So anyway, at this point, I kind of know like, okay, I need to start being more conscious, I need to start paying more attention. So I kind of go in these spurts where I'm like, okay, I'm going to track things more and write everything down and figure this out. And like I do it for a few days, I'd still be having massive blood sugar fluctuations. And so I would give up. Like I would be willing to put in the effort, but I couldn't figure it out. It felt like it just couldn't be done essentially. So by the time November 2022 comes around, so I've had diabetes for 22 years at that point, um, I finally got a continuous glucose monitor. So this essentially gives you the ability to track your blood sugar. I think every 5 minutes you get a reading. Whereas previously I was using like the finger stick, so I might get 10 readings a day. And so when I get this monitor, I already knew my control was kind of bad. But what I see is that the first day I wear it, my blood sugar is reasonable at breakfast, is reasonable at lunch, and in between, there's like a big spike that I wouldn't have seen when I was just doing the finger stick. And so to me, that's kind of the sign, okay, like I knew things were bad, but they might be even worse because I could have been having all these fluctuations that I never even knew about. So that's when it's kind of crazy to say, but that's the first time I decided to Google diabetes management. In 2022 is the first time I decided to Google it. That sounds ridiculous. Um, and on that day, I found Dr. Bernstein. And so Dr. Bernstein is pretty well known in the low carb space. He's kind of the pioneer for the low carb diet for type 1 diabetes or just diabetes in general. But he's not carnivore. So there's a lot of vegetables in his program. It's more focused on protein, but it's just very, very low carb. And so from that day forward, I've been low carb. So it took me one day with a continuous glucose monitor and one day of research to decide to go low carb. Um, and right away, like night and day in my control, the difference. So, like I mentioned before, previously, I'm looking at fluctuations between 3 and 20. The switch to low carb alone makes the fluctuations, I'd say, 3 to 8. And then gradually, it's like more of a smooth line, getting better all the time. Um, and I guess whereas before I would have blood sugars over 15 daily. I think I could say that comfortably. Since switching to low carb, I've had blood sugars of 15 maybe once or twice a year. So it's amazing. Like I used to have to feel that feeling every day, and now it's like a one-off thing if something is like really gone off the rails. Um, so that was with the switch to low carb. But you asked about carnivore, so that came a little bit later, I guess. Um, Obviously, with low carb, I was hooked. I haven't looked back. But I started to really immerse myself in the YouTube community for low carb, and I found this channel called Low Carb and Fasting. And so it's run by a woman named Nairi, and she has type 1 diabetes. And she interviews a lot of carnivores, and she is kind of carnivore adjacent herself. So I watched a number of interviews, particularly her interviewing Dr. Baker, and just got more curious about the carnivore diet and kind of listened to people talk about it for a few months. But at first I thought it was crazy because I hated meat. Like I really hated it my whole life. So I've never been a strict vegetarian, but I've been very plant based. Um, I've eaten like a little bit of chicken here and there, but generally I've just never eaten red meat and never liked it. Um, let's say like once a month I would cook ground beef for my husband, like for tacos, and it would make me gag. Like I remember going to events and being served roast beef, and I would gag. I just hated meat. I don't know. So anyway, so at first I was like, well, carnivore sounds interesting. People sound like they might be getting with control, but it's not something I could ever do. Um, but it's the weird thing where the more you listen to people talk about it, the more curious you get. And the more I started to feel like, no, like I think I want to try this. So I think it was a period of introducing a little bit more meat just to kind of like get used to the taste. And then eventually in September 2023, so almost a full year now, that's when I basically made this switch. So from that point on, I've been completely carnivore in the home. So the only food that I would bring into the house for myself would be red meat, pork, some chicken, and then we eat seafood. And then I do yogurt, cheese, and eggs. So that would be everything I consume in the house. And then I do want to be transparent and say that I probably have vegetables once every 2 weeks at a restaurant. So if I go to a restaurant, like I'll get steak, but I'll still order like a side salad without dressing, and that's just because here you have to pay the full price for the meal, and so I'm going to get a full meal. So yeah, I think it's probably safe to say I'm like 95% carnivore at this point. And now I guess like kind of the quick summary of my journey. But when I started this journey and found low carb, my intention was just to avoid diabetic complications. But now I think my intention has changed slightly. And I actually think it's possible that I can become like healthier than non diabetic people. And now I just feel like I'm just going to be healthy compared to your average person. So my goal has become a bit different, I guess.
So, well, I mean, congratulations on finding low carb and then carnivore. Did anything change with your blood sugars throughout the day? between being low carb to going carnivore?
Mhm. I'm really glad you asked that because they got slightly worse. And it's not something you're going to hear in interviews a lot, but I think I know why. So I'd like to speak to that. So I I want to say I'm a lazy diabetic. And what I mean by that is I don't count anything. So I never counted carbs. And now I don't count protein and I don't weigh any of my food. So some people have like a very mathematical way that they manage their diabetes that involves a lot of counting. I didn't learn it that way. I just have no interest in doing it that way. So basically, I manage my diabetes with intuition. So it's like based on my intuition of what's happened yesterday and what's happened every day before, I make a judgment call about how to dose my insulin. And this intuition has been developed over 20 years of eating a plant based diet. So even when I switched to low carb, it was more like keto, like a lot of salads and things like that. And I know how to dose for those things. But now eating these meals that are just like large meals of meat and protein, I am still struggling to learn the right way to dose. So if you eat carbohydrates, you get like a fast spike in your blood sugar and it's covered by the fast spike of insulin. But now with these protein meals, your blood sugar rises slowly over many hours. And so I am using a pump now, an insulin pump, and you have to use different features of the pump to try and like match that slow rise over many hours. And it's just, I have to say, like, I'm getting better at it all the time, but it's been a huge learning. And so to just put the numbers into context, when I switched to low carb, my A1C was 5.3. So that's in the non-diabetic range, and it was the lowest it's ever been in my life. When I went to carnivore, it went to 5.6. So it's still, I think, based on most criteria, that's still considered just at the top of normal. And I'm hoping my next one will be lower. That one was just a few months ago. So I don't think it's like a consequence of carnivore, but I just wanted to point out that it requires a different skill set to take insulin on carnivore diet. And if you're in any of the Facebook groups, especially for type 1, like it's a common thing people talk about because when you're first diagnosed in mainstream, we're told that you don't have to take insulin for protein only food. So I would have previously thought that meat did not require insulin, which is obviously not true because now I'm eating mostly meat and still need insulin. But it's just very different. And like I said, it's that slow rise that just is still a challenge. But that being said, we're talking about a rise to like an 8, whereas before it was a rise to like a 20. So like it's still amazing. And like I would never switch back.
Right. So now it's just a case of finding the right way to dose.
Yeah.
Okay. So have you noticed anything else change in the time you've been carnivore?
Yeah, I think some other pros, uh, kind of related to my diabetes management, something that I've struggled with my whole life is just kind of like extreme overeating. I really love food, and I'm just someone who's always, if there's pizza, like I can't have just one piece of pizza. If there's cake, I can't have just one piece of cake. And as a diabetic, that's problematic, right? So they say as a diabetic, oh, it's okay, just take enough insulin to cover it, but it's not easy. And I think diabetes is probably easier to manage with carbohydrates if you can moderate. But I am just not someone who can moderate food at all. It's been like a struggle for many years. And so I always just thought, okay, if I just get strong enough, I'll be able to moderate these foods. And then even on like keto or low carb, I was someone who struggled with the keto treats. Um, they're just so good, and I definitely overeat them every time. I couldn't moderate the keto treats, and sure they weren't like spiking my blood sugars, but it's not healthy. Like I don't want to sit down and eat a whole package of treats at one time. So with carnivore, and this is probably even like my main reason for staying carnivore isn't my type 1 diabetes. It's the food cravings have subsided so massively. And so I've noticed that I can eat large quantities of carnivore food and I don't have cravings for more. Um, they just don't prompt that reaction in the brain. I guess it comes from carbohydrates where you want more and you get the cravings. And I'd always be battling it and trying to overcome it. And now I just don't have to worry about it. And I think it's interesting. Like I've noticed because I eat almost zero carbs, when I eat yogurt, I get that little twinge of like a craving, and that would be like the most carbohydrates I eat every day. So it's from the carbohydrate foods that like bring in that voice of that craving. Um, and maybe some people can moderate, but for me, like the carnivore diet and the way that you can just abstain from processed foods and high carb foods, it's so amazing. And that to me is like the number one reason why I would stay carnivore.
Yeah, I know that feeling well. So what do your family and friends think about this way of eating?
Yeah. Um, I think in general, it's perceived as they're happy my diabetes management is going well, but it's a little weird. Um, so my husband, I do all of the cooking and shopping for us, like for our main meals. And so because of that, he's switched to carnivore in his main meals because he just eats like whatever I make. But he still has his own like regular, quote unquote, regular food, like, occasionally outside of the house or if he brings in snacks. So for him, he's kind of made a partial switch. So for him, it's not so weird. For the rest of my family, um, I think, yeah, they more like think it's a weird thing that's working for me. But if I try and explain how its benefits might be helpful for more than just a type 1 diabetic, but more generally helpful, uh, I think they're kind of scared because it's so far from what the mainstream tells us to do that they're just skeptical. They're like, you're eating all this bacon and fatty meat and butter, and they're like, that can't be good. They're like, you need to cook your food in like canola oil, right? And things like that. So they see me using all this butter, and they're like, oh god, like you're gonna have a heart attack. So I think mostly it's been met with skepticism, but already like a year in, I do think my results are starting to speak for themselves, and that's what I hope will continue to happen.
And has anyone kind of been convinced to give it a try besides your husband?
Yeah, for him, I guess it's against his will, but no, no recruits. I mean, no, I would have to say, unfortunately, none. My brother actually has diabetes, type 1 diabetes as well. And even he hasn't expressed an interest yet. But again, I'm only a year in. I'm really curious to see over time, especially, as everyone's health progresses, like if I continue to do well, that I truly believe the results of carnivore are the strongest proponent of the power of carnivore. And I think it's going to reach the point where I don't have to say anything. I just have to continue to get healthier, and then people might pay more attention.
So how do you eat day to day?
Yeah. So I think I listed before generally the foods like that I eat, but I think typical day for me, I do have 3 meals and one small snack. And I know in carnivore community, a lot of people eat like OMAD. I haven't felt the need to do that yet, at least. So for breakfast, I usually have 3 eggs and a few pieces of bacon. And then for lunch is where I have the most variability. It's often leftovers from the night before. So 1 to 2 pieces of meat, like chicken thigh or a burger, sometimes eggs if I don't have anything prepared. And then supper would be where I prepare 2 different types of meat, and that would be like my largest meal. And so we have a lot of steak, ground beef, burger patties, a lot of seafood, and some fatty meats, so like different types of pork ribs and beef ribs. So kind of like quite a large serving of 2 different types of meat at supper time. And then in the evening, I often have, I guess, a small bowl of plain yogurt from a local farmer. So it doesn't have like skim milk powder or additives. It's just like the cultured whole milk.
So just going back to something you said before about, when the carbohydrates and the kind of feeling of wanting to eat all the time. What is can you are you able to describe the difference in feeling of when you are eating carbohydrates, what makes you feel full? And then when you're eating carnivore, what makes you feel full or how you feel?
Hmm. When I was eating carbohydrates, I don't think I ever really felt full. I would always want more. I guess if you're eating a lot of carbohydrates, for me, it might have been if I was eating some like very large takeout meals that were really large. So I think I have like that they call it like volume addiction, where you like to eat a lot of food at once. So yeah, if I was eating really large takeout meals, I might eventually feel full on high carbohydrates, but then as a diabetic, I have to take a lot of insulin, which usually means in a few hours my blood sugar is very low and I have to eat it. So you're just constantly eating all the time. Whereas and you always get the cravings. Like I find every time you eat, you have cravings for more. And with carnivore, it's just not like that. I still eat large quantities of food, but they don't prompt a craving. They don't prompt a voice in my head. I can eat a lot and I can just stop when I feel satisfied. And I don't feel as concerned if I overeat because it doesn't seem to be such a problem. It doesn't spike my blood sugar and it hasn't affected my weight or anything like that.
I think you said it very well there when you described it as volume addiction.
Yeah.
That's a very good description. Like, it's almost like when you're eating carbohydrates that you're just trying to fill yourself up as much as possible until you're able to get your next hit.
Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, and it you don't realize how kind of bad that way of eating is until you get out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the context of type 1 diabetes, where there is quite a movement right now in the mainstream where they're saying you can eat as many carbohydrates as you want. Um, I see articles where they say like you can eat cake, you can eat pizza, just take the right amount of insulin, but they always advocate portion control. And so they'll say something like, you can have half a piece of cake and you'll be fine. And like, sure, if you can do that, I guess that's great. But I think most people can't. And so for most people, I don't think that advice is useful. And that's why I find just completely abstaining from those types of food makes it easier as a diabetic. And I do see people online who they're eating carbohydrates and they're getting reasonable control of their diabetes, but they're always eating carbohydrates in moderation. And so if you're someone who has type 1 diabetes and also struggles with moderating food, you're just in for a lifelong struggle with the food and the high insulin, a battle against each other. And there's no way to win that, I don't think.
Yeah, as someone who can't moderate myself, I fully understand, and, if someone said to me, "Just eat half a piece of cake," I'd be looking at them like, "I thought this was half a piece of cake, I'm waiting on the other half."
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So, if you were to give someone advice on getting started with carnivore, especially if they're a type 1 diabetic, what advice would you give them to make the transition as easy as possible?
Mhm. Yeah. I think my advice would be you have to embrace your quote unquote limitations of having the disease. And so what I mean is diabetes is an inability to process carbohydrates. And so you can decide that you want to eat high carbohydrate foods, and I did for 20 years. Um, and you're just going to be battling every day. You're going to be battling with portion sizes, battling with massive insulin doses and major fluctuations. Um, all because you can't accept the fact that your body can't process carbs. And like maybe some of the technology out there can help, but you're still taking massive insulin doses. But I think if you could just realize, okay, just like someone with a peanut allergy can't eat peanuts, I have diabetes and hence I can't eat large quantities of carbohydrates. Uh, it's like you put your hands up and you're like, I'm done. I'm not in this fight anymore. So you just walk away. You don't have to struggle. And some people think it's like giving up or it's not going along with mainstream guidelines. But I actually think that it's like the ultimate power move because it's like, I'm not even going to do this fight. I'm just going to do it the way that gets results. And so I really think if someone is type 1 and thinking about starting carnivore, they need to have that mindset shift. And because like what your life looks like and what is a reasonable food for you to eat is completely different. But you have to think about your why and your motivation for doing it and realize that your criteria for what is an acceptable food, it does have to change and it has to be motivated by the fact that you have a disease. And it's unfortunate, but we do have it and we can't change that, but we can manage it.
Yeah, that's a really good way of looking at it, you know, because there's sometimes we get in this battle in life, in could be in work, or it's about diet, it's about whatever it is. We're in this battle and we're fighting and fighting and fighting. And, you know, actually, we would probably do so much better if we just stop the fighting and just walk away and just say, I don't need this in my life anymore.
Yeah. And then it's over. Like 20 years of struggle done in one day, one decision. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So Emily, is there a way that people can reach out to you? Do you have any social media or anything like that?
Yeah. I'm not overly active on social media, but if someone has any questions about carnivore in the context of type 1 diabetes, I'm certainly happy to answer anything. So people can reach me through Facebook is probably the best. I'm just on there as Rasta, so it's EM and then ROSTA. They can find me that way.
Sure. So I'll link to that in the show notes. Thank you so much for coming on, Emily, and sharing your story. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me on.